love. Surrender to self-preservation from others who can and sell. A blindness that touches perfection, but hurts just like anything else. Isolation, isolation, isolation.
Okay, so we're back. We're back, and we're going to finish up on Chapter 1 today. I'm going to talk about a couple of bullet points ahead of time. I'm going to try to wrap up Chapter 1 in record time because there's a lot going on in Chapter 1. His four models of his four alternative models to the whole sender, the whole SMRC model, and then his 7 secret tricks or seven secrets about the media that we'll look at and contest. But first off, some bullet points. I want to just update people about what my overall game plan is going into the rest of the weekend and the week to follow. I'm going to do 2 more video lectures. One that will act as the lecture for today, Tuesday, and another one that will act for Thursday. And then next Tuesday on September 22nd at 9:30, we'll all get back together via Blackboard Collaborate. All right. So if you're watching the videos and you're getting the emails, you'll know. I'll send you out a reminder on Sunday night or Monday night to remind you, hey, we're getting back together again. All right. So because there's been a lot of what in the media business is called static, between people, not knowing whether we were meeting or not. But if people had been checking their emails and watched the last video, you kind of know what the game plan is. So be expecting 2 more videos, including this one, between now and say Saturday, and then we're going to get back together next Tuesday. All right. As far as assignments are concerned at this point, if you have done your media arts profile and have responded to somebody else, you're good there. If you have done your mini assignment, you're good there. We're going to be working on chapters 1 and 2. So let's have chapters 1 and 2 of the Hansen book read, and I will continue to unpack them. I gotta work in record time here because I got some things going on after this. So we should just cut to the chase, folks. We were talking a little bit about the sender message channel receiver model, or what is called the SMRC model. It's been called different things by different theorists and academics, but this is the one that Hansen uses. We were talking about a sender. Who is the sender in the mass media process? Just to restate, the sender is in the mass media process is the institutions for the most part, because we're talking about mass media, the newspapers, the conglomerates, Facebook, the Hollywood film industry, cable news networks. That's all considered mass media. However, Hansen will bring in some arguments contesting whether there even is such a thing as mass media at this point, in his 7 secrets, and we'll talk more about that. But the sender, remember, is usually one institution sending its message to a large mass of people, usually people that are anonymous to it, a kind of heterogeneous or mixed group of people, and there's very little feedback. There's less feedback than, say, in social media. Well, we'll talk about that, all right? Because the fact of the matter is that not unlike what I was saying about fake news last time, there has always been feedback. There has always been feedback of one sort or another, regardless of what the media is. Take, for instance, your traditional newspaper. There was always letters to the editors or ed op sections where readers or subscribers would write in. Also, and notwithstanding that, there was always features in newspapers, and there still are, like advice columns, tips and tricks columns, things like Dear Abby, and Ask Ann, and all these kind of things where, distraught people would write in, I'm having a problem, my husband's drinking, or my wife's drinking, and they would answer. So there was always this kind of interactivity that went on. Always interactivity with films, all right, in terms of public support. After everything is said and done, one of the most monumental forms of feedback when it comes to mass media has to do with whether you get people to actually watch your stuff or read your stuff. That's the most potent and most concrete and most monetarily substantive form of feedback, and we'll talk about things like ratings, the Nielsen ratings for television. All of that is feedback. So the case I'm trying to make is there has always been feedback. It's not a new animal. Has it morphed due to the interactivity of social media? Of course it has. But we need to define. We need to be able to parse like what is old and what is new, and what is entirely different, and what is just something kind of dressed up or rebranded as being different, but not really that different. All right, so Hansen. So we talked about how the status of this one to many paradigm has changed due to blogging and interactivity and all of that. We talked about the SCOTUS blog that broke the Obamacare story before the big guys did. The other big thing with there was a very, very famous case, being a Trekkie that I am, being a Star Trek fan. There was a famous case of audience feedback that is worth reading about, and it had to do with the original Star Trek television series. The first, the original, the 1966 Star Trek television series ran for 2 seasons, and they were going to cancel it. There were low ratings. It was costly to produce. There were a lot of extenuating factors. However, and this was a first, television had never seen it before. There was such a flurry of audience blowback that went viral. For whatever constituted viral back in 1968. This thing went viral, and there was this letter writing campaign into NBC, who was producing Star Trek, from all these Trek fans. They just got hundreds of thousands of letters, like thousands and thousands of letters saying, don't take this thing off. And due to that response, due to that blowback, they took everything out of storage and they had a 3rd season, and that was one of the first instances of audience feedback that actually shaped the programming decisions of at that time there was the big 3 networks. There was CBS, there was ABC, and there was NBC. So once again, you see that was an example of feedback. So we move past the sender and we get to the message. What is the message? According to Hansen, the message is the content being transmitted. The content being transmitted by the sender and reacted to by the receiver. I'm going to talk about who the receiver is. However, before, and this has always been a concept in media too, before the message can be sent, it needs to be what is called encoding. encoding, and for us, the idea of encoding is nothing new. Anybody that's taken a computer programming class knows all about encoding or coding, but the whole idea of encoding requires at least 2 steps. All right, it's like encoding is basically nothing more than how you're putting your message together, whether it be the script of your television show, whether it be the web pages on your website, how you put the thing together and assemble it to send out there. All of that is encoding. The production is encoding. The editing of a film is encoding. The uploading of a blog, or the uploading of a podcast, or the uploading of a YouTube video. That's all the encoding process of getting. Basically, it's just an egghead term for getting the thing together to be sent out. And that goes from everything from people kicking around the idea for a concept for a show, to writing the actual scripts, to the actual production, and all. That's the encoding. Or, for instance, in written media, the encoding would be what? The writing of the book, and then the preparing it for publication, right? Encoding. So first, the sender's ideas must be turned into a message. What is the message? Is the thing, the content. A script for a broadcast is drafted, a graphic is created, a newspaper story is written. It is that production process that is called encoding. A script for a broadcast is okay. Second, the message must be prepared for transmission. All right, and that's just all the fine tuning. That's running the newspaper. That's getting the newspaper story out of the journalist. Nowadays, it's just sending it to your editor. The editor looks at it. He proofreads it. He sends it down to the typesetter. And voila, the thing starts getting pumped out. For the daily newspaper. The script is taped and sent out over the air. The graphic is placed on a web page, or the newspaper is printed. All right, so that's all part of the whole message component. All right. One thing that Hansen has to stress about mass media is this: mass media usually costs a lot of this, a lot of the paper, as they say, a lot of money in order to get a message out to, first of all, there's the production process, then there's the public relations and publicity component of it, then it's getting it out there, getting stuff out there. That all involves huge amounts of infrastructure between affiliates and transmissions and tech people to run the stuff. That's all part of it, and it's always big money. And he stresses the idea of high profile events, like for instance the Super Bowl, right? To air, it used to be back in the cost of a Super Bowl ad doubled in the last decade. $5 million. Now it's $5 million for a 30-second commercial. $5 million for a 30-second commercial. That is a lot of money. It usually takes a lot of capital, And now what we're seeing, and he will also touch upon this, and this will become a big, big component, a big issue, and a big overarching theme of any mass media class at this point, is how all of that infrastructure, all of the means of that production is falling into fewer and fewer hands at the top. And we call that media consolidation or media conglomeration. And that all has to do with the big fish. Remember we were talking about the Oscars in the tank, eating up the little fish, all right, and becoming the primary sources for all information and all media and all entertainment on the planet. Whereas at one time it might have been in the hands of, let's say, theoretically 40 or 50 different, medium-sized, fairly sizable outlets. Now it's all kind of funneling up to the top. And we'll have to talk a lot about what that does in terms of your choices, in terms of the overall messages that are getting out there, in terms of censorship and all of that. Media conglomeration, as we know it, opens up a huge moral, ethical, economic, and political kettle of fish. And he used the he had a shot of this Eli Manning and Odell Beckham commercial from, I can't even remember what Super Bowl it was, where they were just lollygagging about. And if any of you follow sports at all, you might have heard about Mr. Beckham's recent tweet that certainly falls under the category, I believe, of TMI. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I would suggest that you Google Mr. Beckham's name under recent news articles. You know, Odell, it's like, you're talking to a Giants fan here, all right? You're talking to a Giants fan who has been following the Giants since he was like 6 years old, all right? Well before Phil Simms, you know, but it's like, well before even that, you know? So it's like, I have like this vested interest in what former and current players on that particular, or in that particular organization do or don't do. One of the things that I want to like draw attention to is that if you're not aware of it, this class and the other class, we always really need to continue to open up an arena and a forum for the things that are going on with mass media in terms of like what's going on today, you know. And certainly there is, you'd have to be living in a cave or not be watching the news at all to understand what a large percentage of professional sports players are doing or not doing in support of certain social and political and racial justice movements right now. And I think credit needs to be given where it's due. And this is all like fodder for like, you know, you sports guys. You guys are really into sports and sports media, and I know that some of you are. You know, it's like your wheels need to start turning about the kind of things you can do as either your media scan or your final project. You know, that there's a lot of issues here that are fair game to talk about. All right, and certainly, you know, what's going on in the national sports industry, regardless of whether it's baseball, football. I mean, this is all, I would love to see like a huge major project of what the sports industry is morphing into under both the due to the pandemic and due to the recent calls for social justice, the recent protests and calls for social justice. That would be a great project or a great media scan. So, but Odell, he's a little bit wild, as we say. Hansen wants to pose the question, what do all these messages mean? He wants to talk about the meaning of the messages. What does it all mean? All right. This usually, and we do this in mass media research methods. This usually all kind of falls under this egghead area of academic study called semiotics. It's just semiotics. It's a term that is used to. It's an egghead term that is basically just used to ask the question: how do we derive meaning whether it be from the written word or an image or a painting or a film, how is meaning transferred from one person to another? How does that happen? Because people, more often than not, don't really think about it. They don't think about the idea that, it's like, here I am, like, encoding this message, as the encoding is what? The encoding is what is coming out of my mouth right now, and how it's reaching the camera, and how I'll later, like, assemble it in editing software, and then output it, and then put it on YouTube, and then put it on the blog, and then, a day or two later, you'll be able to take this thing up, and that the message, the primary question to ask here is, how is communication even possible? There must be some kind of consensus, and this gets into some heavy stuff about what constitutes meaning. How is it that, everybody will laugh at the same joke during a comedy series? Or how is it that everybody kind of gets all, like, bent out of shape, when, in the Avengers, when the villain decides to, like, wipe out half the population, everybody kind of goes, ooh, at the same time, as opposed to, ha, 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 what do all these messages mean, and how do they mean stuff? Hansen says, according to media scholar James Potter, the meaning of messages depends on who is receiving them and what kinds of media literacy skills the receivers can use to decode them. All right? So we're talking about an encoding process. There's also a decoding process. How do we decode the message? All right. Potter writes that people with low, and this also brings in the idea of media literacy that we have got to kind of unpack, because media literacy is very distinct from, say, regular, like, book learning literacy in terms of how it's defined, what are its traits, why is it useful, all of that, Potter says the meaning of messages depends on who's receiving them and what kind of media literacy skills the receiver can use to decode them. Potter writes that people with low levels of media literacy will look at the surface meanings in media content, the surface meanings, whereas those with higher levels of media literacy can interpret messages from a wide range of perspectives with many choices of meanings, all right? So there's this whole idea of, like, media literacy involving what I would contend is, like, cultural literacy. How much of the world do you know about? How much have you read? How culturally literate are you? That to the fact that you can read something on certain levels, and we've been talking a lot about this in the other class, due to the fact that we're watching a film called The Matrix that exists and can be read and taken up on a lot of different levels as an allegory, as an action film. That it's like I always tell my documentary kids when I teach documentary, or my documentary students, it's like for any documentary, there's always, like, what I would break down as being the apparent meaning. What is the apparent meaning of a film? All right? It's about this, all right? But what are the deeper meanings? What are the implications? What's it trying to talk about? What are the connotations? That, for instance, we were talking about how this Chinese documentary filmmaker made a documentary about the Chinese version of American Idol. And it wasn't just about American Idol, right? Or Chinese Idol, or whatever it's called. I still can't remember the name of it. It was about society. It was a way of using that particular phenomena as a way of looking at the society at large, right? So that, the best media usually has an apparent meaning and a deeper meaning, and this is usually what separates the wheat from the chaff, in terms of what gets out there, For example, Patty Jenkins's Wonder Woman, released in the summer of 2017, was the first modern superhero movie to be both directed by and star a woman. These were both firsts, you know. And a lot was made, a lot of hullabaloo was made due to the fact that it came out during this whole Me Too phenomena, you know. And there were a lot of hopes and expectations and aspirations pinned on how the script and how the actress would portray this character as a positive, and it was under a lot of scrutiny. It was under a lot of scrutiny as to the ways in which it would portray its female character and what it would say about the feminist movement, what it would say about the position of how it would empower young women, all of that. It was this huge kettle of fish. You know, the movie tells of Amazon and demigod warrior Diana as she is forced to confront the evil events of World War I. The movie can be taken up on different levels. The movie can be seen as a simple heroic adventure story. You know, we can just read it as that, just popcorn entertainment. You go, she fights the villains, she wins or loses. I can't remember. I watched some of it. I'm pretty sure she wins. She's got a love interest who also, you know, will have to represent certain characteristics, you know, in 2020, as opposed to, you know, the love interest of somebody in 1950. The movie can be seen as a simple heroic adventure story, an allegory on the nature of good and evil, and we know what an allegory is, right? It's a metaphor. It's an interpretation of things. An allegory on the nature of good and evil, or a treatise on the differences between masculine and feminine responses to the world. Can be read on all these different levels, all right? Different lenses to interpret it and take this thing on. Which of these interpretations is correct? Hansen asked rhetorically. Although Wonder Woman is most emphatically an adventure story, it also tells of the mythical conflict between Ares, the god of war, and Diana, a demigod whose responsibility is to defend humans. And we talked a lot about this in the other class, how a lot of these action adventure films, particularly of the superhero variety, derive their source material from a lot of different places. Greek mythology, sometimes Shakespeare, always, you know, it's like my old friend Dr. Stefan Heller used to say, if it doesn't, he was in his Hungarian accent, if it doesn't come from anywhere, it's not going anywhere. If it doesn't come from something, and that's not to say that there's nothing new under the sun. It's just that we tend to create stories and media predicated on things that existed before. These ideas. So there's that. All right. So after the sender and the message, we have the channel. What is the channel? The channel is very simple and at the same time kind of complicated, because the channel and the message sometimes are pretty much incorporated within the same package, right? You know, when we think about it, they're very, very interrelated, you know. But the channel is what? The way that it gets to you. The way that message, which has been encoded, finally gets to you. All right? And it can come in many different forms, whether it be a book, a magazine, a newspaper, a billboard. Billboards count, you know, as mass media, definitely. Posters, radio, sound recordings, right? Whether it be Spotify or whether it be an old, you know, wax 45, right? Interactive media include the web, social media, mobile media, and video games, all right? So that's all the different channels, you know, that these come from, but it's kind of like interconnected with the content itself, right? Then he poses a what if. He poses a question about, what about these other things? Can we safely define these other things as mass media? And he gives us a list. What about faxes? Remember the fax machines? Nowadays it's kind of like Fred and Flintstone and Barney Rubble. It's fat, but they still exist. In these far off pockets of the underdeveloped world. What about letters, text messages, email? Do they fit in as channels of mass communication? And Hansen will respond, although email is not generally considered to be a mass medium, an unsolicited, remember, it's like, we're back at the level of like group interaction or one-on-one interaction when it comes to email. Even like a big email thread, like there is this kind of like one-to-many component of an email that I send out to the class of 20 people, but it's still at kind of the level of group. We haven't hit the level of mass media yet. But he says like, for instance, like an unsolicited commercial email known as spam, right? We all know what spam is. We are all inflicted with spam every day, and have to deal with it accordingly. And, certainly our email servers are equipped to kind of say, away with you. Spam could satisfy at least part of the definition of mass communication, because once again, it's a message going out to, a lot of times spam will go out to what? 1 million people, a couple million people. All of them unknown to the sender. Since spam is distributed widely to a large mixed and anonymous audience. News reports and sports scores arrive via SMS text messages on the small screen on a mobile phone would seem to qualify. Yeah, SMS text would qualify as a kind of one-to-many thing, because a lot of times with an SMS text, it's reaching, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. News reports and sports score, okay, so that on the small screen, on a mobile phone. But our phone calls, texts, and emails from friends are generally considered to be interpersonal communications, unless we post them to a blog or a social media site for a whole bunch of people to see. And sometimes, it's like we know about blogs and social media sites that have a lot of followers. So phone calls, texts, emails from friends are generally considered to be interpersonal communication, not intrapersonal, not group communication, but interpersonal communication, unless we post them to a blog or a social media site for everyone to see. Now we have to talk about the receiver. What does Hansen have to say about the receiver? Who is the receiver in the mass communication process? Well, the receiver is usually who? The masses. Right? The masses. What are the masses? The masses are, it's a fairly nebulous term to define, the American populace or the population of the world, or a sizable enough chunk of that populace. At that point, we're not talking about tens. We're talking about hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, the masses. And Hansen says, in regards to the masses, the receiver is the audience for the mass communication message. That is the people who are receiving and decoding the message. Decoding is the process of translating a signal from a mass medium into a form that the receiver can understand, right? It's like, if I don't understand Spanish and I'm taking a vacation in Guadalajara or Mexico City, there'll be a lot, and I'm in my hotel room and I'm going through the channels, there'll be a lot of stuff on there. Some of it, especially in hotel rooms, is not that great. that I won't be able to understand. I will not be able to decode it because I don't know Spanish. You know, I need the tools to be able to decode something in a way in which the sender had intended it. You know, and that's not just a question of a language barrier. Once again, it's a question of, you know, a certain level of consensus cultural literacy. You know, that, you know, when a comedy show puts together jokes, there's a shared understanding that we know what's funny and we know what's not for our given social milieu and our times, you know. You know, once again, it's like it doesn't always, the receiver isn't always able to decode it. You know, I'm sure that everyone in this class at one time or another told a joke or had a joke told to them and they didn't get it, you know, or they didn't get it at first, you know. You know, maybe there was that delay, you know. Some of the funniest jokes have that kind of like, oh, now I get it. Now I get it. So decoding is the process of being able to translate a signal, and that involves certain kind of tools, right? From a mass medium into a form that the receiver can understand. The term mass can have at least two meanings when referring to audiences. In one sense, the term refers to the mix of ordinary people who receive the message, the masses. In another sense, the term refers to the size of the audience. The concept of mass, or popular taste is an old one, but the concept of a massive or large audience developed in the 20th century. All right, it was only within the 20th century, and we'll talk about this, that with the coming of radio, with the coming of television, with the coming of films, that one would actually start to have a mass audience of any kind of size. Were there mass audiences during the print age? Yeah, you know, certainly, like the Bible was read by a mass audience, but in a very, very limited form because of the levels of literacy and production and all that. Certainly not the kind of numbers that we see, for instance, like watching the Super Bowl, you know, or watching, you know, whatever the new show is. You know, those numbers, we're talking thousands versus millions. You know, mass audience reading major newspapers, listening to the radio, watching network television, or going to movies are much larger than the crowds of people who gather for events such as political rallies or even rock concerts. They form a heterogeneous audience, an audience made up of a mix of people who differ in age, sex, income, education, ethnicity, race, religion, and other characteristics. Receivers don't always get a clear message from the sender, however. There's several types of noise, or what is called static, that can interfere in this whole. It's never just this clear-cut process between sender, oh, I get it. There's all kinds of technological and semiotic and rhetorical elements that can cause static, you know. Several types of noise that can interfere with the delivery of the message. There's semantic noise. I don't understand what you're saying. Sometimes, for instance, there may be semantic noise between me and y'all. You know, say I use a word that you don't understand. You know, and you need to go. You know, if you're a good student, you will go and like promptly and diligently, you know, phonetically sound it out. You know, and find out the definition, right? There's semantic noise, which occurs when the receiver does not understand the meaning of the message, such as when you can't understand the lyrics on a Latin music channel if you don't speak Spanish. Mechanical noise, you know, which occurs when the channel has trouble transmitting the message. We've all been there in the car sometimes, especially if you're on a trip or you're going out of state or you're going on vacation somewhere, you're traveling down an interstate, and all of a sudden it's like, you know, you're listening to, you know, a version of whatever, you know, and all of a sudden it just kind of goes out, you know, or it just starts fading off, you know. And if it's a song you really like, you'll go and try to like, oh crap, you know, and it's like it's like that's static. thunderstorm, like atmospheric problems when it comes to radio wave or television wave transmissions. It's like, I think that it's become less of a thing due to like cable, but back in the day, it's like I remember like having to adjust like the antenna of the television set. They call them rabbit ears. They call them rabbit ears because it was like just these two antennae, and sometimes it's like you get a bad set, you could just, the picture would look like crap, and you'd sit there, or my father would sit there, and you would try all kinds of other contrivances, like hooking up a coat hanger to it to see if that would, and it would often work. It was often like, kind of like that. The receiver of a mass communication message has traditionally been seen as an anonymous audience. We've already been up this road. So we know what the sender, and this particular model, the SMR, so let's just recap. The SMRC model, the S stands for sender, the M stands for message. Remember the idea of encoding. The message has to be encoded, all right? Then it has to go through a channel, all right? Even when I'm on a corner talking with somebody, there is a channel, all right? The air that and the light that person can read my lips, and there's a channel, all right? And then there's got to be a receiver, or it's not mass communication. It needs all those components to qualify as mass media and mass communication. Then Hansen wants to get into some alternative contemporary models that contest this model. All right? And he'll proceed in saying that though the transmission model is useful for laying out the various elements of the mass communication process, it does not explain how mass communication works in our lives. All right? He's trying to get to a deeper meaning to this. It kind of gives you the what and the how, but it doesn't really deal as much, and the when, but not as much with the why. Why does it happen? Why do we need it? Why are people attracted to it? Whereas other models will kind of try to deal with the why of it, W-H-Y. If the SMRC model, the SMCR model rather, focuses primarily on the process of transmitting messages largely from the point of view of a sender trying to have an effect on the receiver. Media scholar Dennis McQuail lays out 3 alternative contemporary models that help us answer 3 different questions about the nature of communication, all right? And it has to do, and they have to do with these 3 different questions of 3 different questions have to deal with what? The model itself, the orientation of the sender. How is the sender positioned in relation to the media, and the orientation of the orientation of the sender? How is the sender positioned, and the orientation of the receiver? All right, and this is, and when we say orientation, we don't necessarily mean whatever. It's like it's not just a question of where you're sitting in the room, or whether you like chocolate or vanilla or whatever. It's a question of how you're positioned in terms of your own level of media literacy and cognitive awareness, and your emotional makeup, and what you like aesthetically, things you like, things you don't like. That's all part of it in these other models, So the first one he talks about is this ritual model. Before that, I want to just really briefly talk about this idea of a model. What's a model? Not just necessarily, we're not talking about the models that walk down the runway on Project Runway, or the elite Ford models that rock stars date, you know. And we're not talking about the models that we used to build when we were kids, of, you know, El Camino, or, you know, a battle cruiser or whatever. We're talking about a model as a cognitive tool, right? Best definition of a model that was ever given to me was from a friend of mine. I've already talked about him, Dr. Heller, a good friend of mine, an older friend of mine, that, and I'll never forget what he said. He said he defined a model thusly. A model. What's a model? A useful approximation of the way things seem to be happening. Think about it. A useful approximation of the way that things seem to be happening. All right? Do models change depending on changing conditions? Absolutely. Is a model always like the truth? Not necessarily. You know, once again, it becomes a question of, you know, what new information do we need as an evolving civilization? You know, remember that, you know, for hundreds of years, the model of the Earth had a tendency to kind of look like this. Look like this. This was like the model, right? And then a bunch of like real smart guys and women, I'm sure, got together, and the model changed into looking something more like this. You know? Was the one useful at the time? Was this one useful at the time that it was being used? Probably. Is this one also useful? Most indefinitely. But models change, right? And they're always an approximation. It is always, like we say in the other class, the map. It's not the territory, you know, of the way that things seem to be happening, you know. Take, like, for instance, I mean, now, more than ever, it's like people are checking models of things. For instance, models of the way that the pandemic is operating, you know, on maps, you know, or models of how it's operating in the human body. This is all these kind of stand-in approximations that we kind of spatialize something and give it symbols in order to represent it, you know. So I would write that down. The first one that McQuail, Hansen, citing McQuail, wants to talk about is this ritual model. He says the ritual model is more concerned with the way that people use mass media as opposed to this whole sender-receiver model. How do we implement mass media in our lives for other reasons, for psychological, social, or emotional reasons? Remember, I was talking about how during old-time radio, you know, after dinner, the whole family, the whole nuclear family, mom, dad, and the kids would sit down around this box, and it would say things and give them information and tell them stories and stuff like that. And it would be a ritual, not unlike the ritual, not unlike the rituals of how we share food together, or how we mate, or how we meet people, or how we become friends with people. That these are all rituals, you know. You know, for instance, it's like this is not an uncommon phenomena of people that get together. Say like a friend of mine and I will get together and we'll go play handball or something, or we'll play tennis, and the tennis isn't, or we'll go play cards together, or role-playing games, or meeting together on some multiplayer, you know, game site. You know, that the game itself is important, in itself, yeah, the going out and playing the game, you know, you want to play, you want to stay fit, but it's more about getting with your friends, you know, it's more about, and the thing itself, the activity, so there's, that the activity itself is a ritual that has other connotations to it, and it serves other functions for us to stay socialized and communicate with people and just have a healthy social interaction, right? So there's this, like, the ritual model looks at how and why audience members, receivers, consume media messages, right? He also goes on to talk about the way, for instance, that the ritual is extended through television to other groups of people all across the United States. Media consumption that thus goes beyond simple delivering of messages and becomes a shared experience that brings us together as people, as pizza. Brings us together for pizza. Pizza can be a good way. Pizza is a medium in that way. You can get together with your friends. But is there, so he uses the example of a terrorist bombing that killed 22 people and injured 50 others in Manchester at this Ariana Grande concert, and how the Twitterscape became this way of people to grieve. You know, not unlike, you know, for instance, during, you know, 9/11 just passed. You know, it's like, you know, I was pretty well up in age to remember. A lot of you weren't even around when 9/11 happened, but the television became this conduit for this ritual of grief. You know, it's not always good. These rituals aren't always good, but it's a way of us to kind of expiate or express our sorrow. And even, like, you know, Facebook, you know, somebody dies, you know, you post something, everybody, it's a form of commiseration. You know, these rituals, you know. And a lot of these rituals, you know, due to the pandemic, have been considerably impacted. You know, rituals, for instance, of, say, outdoor concerts. You know, rituals of, you know, going to the big game, you know, at the stadium. You know, rituals of, you know, hooking up, you know, with all your friends to, you know, do whatever, go out for pizza or whatever. A lot of these things were impacted by the pandemic. Then he's got this idea of the publicity model. All right? The publicity model. And what does he say about the publicity model? Basically, what he says about the publicity model is that, and the big takeaway with the publicity model is this, and it's very important to take into consideration because it has a backside to it and a downside to it that, especially during 2020, we should be very, very conscious and conscientious of, and it has to do with the fact that the mere fact that a topic is covered by the media can make the topic important, all right? By the very fact that it's being communicated by the mass media, it becomes important, all right? And there is a kind of cognitive dissonance that goes on here, right? Because we have to start to understand how, through media literacy, we are able to start to parse through things and realize when something, we need to be able to start to make educated distinctions in our consumption of mass media about what is truly important in any kind of way that it would actively affect us and directly affect our lives, or B, affect the lives of a large enough number of people, or C, is it just distraction? Is it just cotton candy? You know, is it just, you know, clickbait? You know, and that we're going to have to talk about this guy Neil Postman that says that, you know, now we live in this age where that the mass media has this leveling effect, you know, like, you know, and how we take things up, you know, and the juxtaposition of certain stories, you know, for instance, he talks about, say, for instance, a natural disaster in a far off part of the world that impacts hundreds of thousands or kills hundreds of thousands of people or thousands of people, juxtaposed for a commercial for an exercycle, and how these things, and Neil Postman would talk about how the populace will have a tendency to take everything up on the same level, like due to their juxtaposition. It's like we don't have a sense of like what has true life weight to it and what doesn't. All right, that these things get like kind of mixed around. This also ties into the idea that there is no such thing as bad publicity. That's an old saying. There's no such thing as bad publicity, due to the fact that if somebody's talking about you and it's like, say for instance, you're Odell. This is a perfect example. This whole Odell Beckham story that just like hit about what he tweeted. It's like, I'm sure there's like millions of people and all these like sports radio jocks, these guys, all right? No offense, all right? But when you spend all your day, conversing about, games where people hit balls with sticks and chase balls on the grass, it's different than talking about like the pandemic, all right? There's no such thing as bad. So it becomes a question of, and he uses this incident that happened. I think it was at I can't remember which Super Bowl it was. It was at the '93 Super Bowl, where during the halftime show, Janet Jackson, who was a big star at that time, and Justin Timberlake were doing a duet together, and lo and behold, during their duet that had erotic overtones to it, with a song that had erotic overtones to it, a piece of Miss Jackson's apparel malfunctioned and revealed a part of her anatomy that one usually doesn't see during the Super Bowl halftime show. And there was a huge outcry. And we'll talk about all these kind of moral outcries about, what is obscene. We're going to go through all that. Censorship, what is obscene, how they come up with these definitions, community standards, and this like backlash that happens, with a lot of regularity, by certain groups that start to make decisions about, what the effect of the content might be, especially like on children or young adults or the elderly or whatever. But there's this whole idea of the publicity. So after everything is said and done, there's this publicity model, all right, of media. There's also what Hansen calls a reception model, all right. And what's he trying to say here? All he's trying to say with the reception model is this, and I'll just quote him verbatim. The reception model moves us out of the realm of social science analysis and into the world of critical theory, all right? Instead of looking at how messages affect audiences or are used by the senders or receivers, the reception model looks at how audience members derive and create meaning out of media content. Rather than seeing content as having an intended fixed meaning, the reception model says that each receiver decodes, that's each individual receiver, right? Each receiver decodes the message based on his or her own unique experiences, feelings, and beliefs. You can take for instance, he says you can take a single news story and show it to a liberal viewer or a conservative viewer, and both will claim that it is biased against their point of view. In fact, a 1982 study showed that more journalists tried to present the more journalists tried to present multiple sides of an issue, the more partisans on either side, whether conservative or liberal, of the issue viewed the story as biased. All right, and we're going to talk more and more about media bias. So basically, the takeaway with this model is that different things mean different people will take up messages in different ways. What you may or may not, find offensive, your neighbor might find highly offensive, or what you might think is, the greatest music since, sliced bread. It's like your boomer neighbor might think it's noise and it should be banned, and then even among friends, you get into arguments about, who's better, or what show is better, or what Marvel superhero is better, so that it's always about, so that this model kind of looks at the way things are taken up, the way that we receive things as opposed to the message itself, because a lot of times, like, for instance, especially now, it's like right now, during this period between now and November, the election cycle, the election phenomena, has ample opportunities for you to look at and decide whether a message is because here's the thing, all right? Let's say I'm a politician, and we saw this to the run up to the primaries, right? A lot of times it's like, potential candidates dropped out due to a number of factors, but always and everywhere in any kind of electoral process, in a democratic electoral process, more often than not, it has to do with the message that the politician encodes, what he or she stands for, and the way they put it out there fails to reach its audience, or it just doesn't hit them, or they just don't get it, or they just didn't hit the right notes of feeling for the particular time, or they might have said something offensive. So all this stuff about this reception model in lieu of like political campaigns and getting your message out there, it has these huge implications. The reception model, it's like one might contend is a very, very important model to decode, what happens, in terms of, presidential elections and local elections and all of that. Quickly. Get into this. Then he starts getting into, excuse me, the evolution of the media world. How did it happen? How did it happen that we went in and at least geologically speaking, a very, very short period of time from like reading, and I always talk a lot about this in my classes. This whole idea of the concept of the reset, of doing a reset, all right, and not taking certain things for granted, all right. For instance, being able to put yourself in a position of somebody historically that didn't have television, that didn't even know what television was, not to mention like the internet or anything like that. For a large period of my life, growing up in the 70s, it was like there was no, the whole idea that there would be email, internet, blogging, mobile gaming, all this stuff, it would never have occurred to us. We lived in another mobile phones. For most of my life, it's like I never had a mobile phone. When the phone rang at it's like you had a landline, and if you were not home, when the phone rang or somebody called you, that person was out of luck, or you were out of luck. Same thing with like with episodic television. You couldn't just program. It's like For instance, I had this favorite show on Sunday night. On Friday nights, there was a show I used to like to watch, this monster show called The Night Stalker. Around the age I was 16 or 17 years old, and I could remember being out on a summer night and riding bikes with my friends, or playing basketball back with my friends, and I'd be like looking at my watch. I'm like, oh shit! It's like The Night Stalker is going to be on in 10 minutes. I gotta go, and you would go, because there was no maybe I'll catch it later. There wasn't even maybe I'll tape it and watch it later, right? So this whole idea of being able to reset yourself and to put yourself into the sociological and historical position of a person without all this stuff, all right? Watch movies, right? But here's a good thought experiment, all right? Watch movies from like the 70s or the 80s, where there be action films or comedies, before there was no internet, before there was no texting, and ask yourself if the plots, for instance, of a rom-com in the 70s could have happened in 2020 and vice versa. All right, because a lot of times it's like slapstick and screwball comedies and rom-coms and stuff like that were all based on old media, and miscommunication, between that, So this whole idea of doing a reset. So we come back to this: where did our media world come from? Is it just the product of the late 20th century with its constant flow of print and electronic messages? Not really. The world of interconnected and overlapping communication networks that surround us has been evolving for hundreds of years. Before the advent of mass media, people interacted primarily face-to-face. That's all you had, And we need to talk about this evolution of, like, print, the evolution of language, print media, all that stuff, But at the same time, it's like, even as early as the 1880s, here's a photograph of a New York City skyline where there's tons of, there's already, like over 240 years ago, there's already this incredible network of telegraph lines primarily. The telegraph, don't want to go there. He says, the evolution of media? He says, Hansen says, what were the first versions of anything that resembled mass media? He makes the case for the early Roman Catholic Church being the first network of civilization that was allowed to carry large messages to a large amount of people. That's arguable, in my opinion, because when we think about everything from like the ancient Egyptians to the Greeks to the Romans to the Chinese empires that were built, there had to be. I would contend that it was earlier. In order to build an empire, there needs to be a way of communicating things on a mass level. In order to make that happen, in order to go from like a tribal civilization or a civilization of just like these little villages and huts and stuff like that, to go to an empire like the Roman Empire, you need a series of ways of getting information across, so it might be a little earlier than that, but I kind of get it. I get where he's going with this, that the Roman Catholic Church kind of got there first. Then comes books, and books will be a game changer. Every single one of these media innovations will be a game changer in numerous ways, all right? But when books come along, it's a game changer, all right? And here's the thing, and this goes back to the type of things that Marshall McLuhan had to say about media. when a new form of media comes about, remember we were talking about it, it just doesn't change the nature of media. It changes everything. It changes politics. It changes the way we do religion. It's the way that families are built. It's the way that we see the courtship rituals. You know, how we do war. You know, how we engage in combat. You know, all of this changes with each change in the media. For instance, with books. You know, it's like later on in some of these other chapters, we'll start to realize that it was only through the printing press, all right, and movable type, and people being able to disseminate information out to a mass of people that things like, for instance, the American Revolutionary War was even possible. It's like, in order to start any kind of like social movement, you need to have everybody on the same page, in a sense. And you need to be able to discuss ideas and have a consensus, you know. Hence the need for this, like, hence the need for a standardized language and a standardized way of disseminating communication. So books and literacy will become a game changer, and we'll talk about that. Then for Hansen comes the telegraph. Remember, for those of you who don't know what a telegraph was basically being able to communicate through wires. All right, and what was ultimately called Morse code. You know, these dots and dashes that. But the game changer with the telegraph would be the fact that, you know, once in around by the 1860s, and this is around the time of the Civil War, once there's a transatlantic telegraph line set up between the United States and Europe, you didn't have to wait 2 weeks for communications. Remember, before that, there's no way. How can you communicate? There's no radio. There's nothing. There's ships, you know, going back and forth with messages for people and loved ones, and that could take a tremendous amount of time, you know. It's like, imagine playing chess by mail with across the Atlantic. A game could take your whole life, you know. It's like, your game could take your whole life. All right, so there's that. Then in the 1880s, we get the gramophone, recorded music, and that will be a game changer, because before that, before music is recorded, the only way that you could experience music was in a live setting with people playing it or you playing it yourself, all right? And that would be a ritual, all right? Then comes records, all right, where you could record a performance. That would change the way that we lived our lives. With each of these, we have to understand that with each innovation, it changes the way that we live our lives, right? Radio comes along, wireless radio. By the late 19th century, once again, no longer do we need no longer do we need the telegraph line. We can transmit these radio waves with these transmitters in the air and reach hundreds of thousands of people. Radio becomes the big thing, all right? Radio will tell you about wars, all right? Radio is what Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president of the United States during the later half of the Depression and World War II, would communicate with all America, you know, and sell them on ideas or share their grief or get information out. That the radio was a political instrument, you know, a new kind of way of doing things, you know. Then comes the movies. Shortly after that, being able to go to movies and watch them, that will change the game too, and we'll talk more about that. Then comes television, and of course, after that comes online media and interactivity. But before interactivity, there is this whole period of during the television era where There's recordable technology, and that was a huge revolution too, of VCRs, of being able to record shows. And there would be battles too in each of these forums, right? VCRs would be a big thing. Being able to record stuff, being able to buy movies, that would be a huge game changer. You know, instead of having to like, you know, go to the movies, it's like, you know, it used to be like back in the day, it was like, you know, if a big movie opened up, like Star Wars or whatever, Gone with the Wind or whatever, it's like, it would have its run in a movie theater, and then they would pull it, and you wouldn't see it again. You would have no means to see it again until it came back on television, usually edited, but recordable videotapes. All of a sudden, you got to own Star Wars. You got to own Gone with the Wind. You got to own like Beverly Hills Chihuahua. You know, my personal favorite. You got to own these films and play them over and over again. And I'm sure some of you, as you were youngins, drove your parents crazy over the fact that you forced them to sit there and watch Little Nemo or watch Pocahontas or watch Frozen 800 freaking times until you drove them crazy. But you had the movie, so you just watch it over and over again. Online's media interactivity was the culmination of a trend towards giving audience members new control of their communication world. The growth of cable and satellite television, along with the VCR, have already given viewers more choices and more control, and the remote control allowed them to choose among dozens of channels without leaving their chairs. The implications of interactivity are significant, he says. The implications of interactivity are significant, whereas the commercial media have come to be controlled by a smaller and smaller number of large corporations. Remember, the means of this mass media production is getting into the hands of fewer and fewer people. An important channel of mass communication is open to ordinary people in ways that were never possible. And we're going to have to talk about this kind of tug of war that seems to go on between, you know, the small independents and the bloggers and the podcasters, and what goes on with the big media giants. And is that a fair fight? You know, we need to be able to pose the question: is that a fair balance, really? With a trivial investment in a mobile device or computer, the individual can grab the spotlight with news and entertainment through social media and the World Wide Web. All right. And I'm just going to end with this today, because there's a lot more we got to go over with this. I'll knock this out in the beginning of the next lecture, but media literacy, what is it? People like kick it around like a lot of other terms. Like, we need more media literacy. You know, it's like, you know, more often than not, when people call for it, they don't even know what it is, really. Or they call for it's like, you know, or they call for the wrong kind of media literacy. The term media literacy refers to people's understanding of what the media are, how they operate, what messages they are delivering, what roles they play in society, and how audience members respond to media messages. All right? How do we respond to them? Media scholar James Potter writes that people with high levels of media literacy have a great deal of control over the vision of the world they see through the media and can decide for themselves what the messages mean. In contrast, those with low levels of media literacy can develop exaggerated impressions of problems in society, even when those impressions conflict with their own experience. So we have to talk about this idea of this kind of cognitive dissonance that goes on between the world as it is portrayed by the mass media and the world that we live, right? And being able to make these, and that it seems like one of the requirements of media literacy has to do with being able to make those kind of distinctions, you know. And contrast those with low levels of media literacy. Okay, blah, blah, blah. For example, media consumers who spend large amounts of time watching television often perceive society as far more dangerous and crime-ridden than it is because that's the image they see on television. Potter says that too often consumers with low levels of media literacy assume that the media have large, obvious, and mostly negative effects on other people, but little or no effect on themselves. And we'll talk about that phenomena, about how it's like it's always happening to somebody else, but it's not happening to me, and what it's called. Finally, those with low levels of media literacy tend to blame the media for complex social problems, such as teen pregnancy, or school violence, or dare I say it, some blame the media for the prevalence of the pandemic. You know, they blame the media on it. Gonna wrap up here. Gotta move on. Got some stuff I gotta take care of. Read chapter 2. We're gonna wrap this one up in the next lecture. Read chapter 2. I'm gonna start up on chapter 2 in the next lecture. And remember, we will be meeting back next Tuesday, the 22nd. Yeah, I'm double checking here. The 22nd at 9:30 on Collaborate. Alright? So please do not email me asking me when we're meeting. Alright? Because that will just be the giveaway. You'll be giving yourself away that you did not watch this lecture, and you will be in the doghouse. You know, and you'll be bad. So anyway, I hope everybody is well. I'm sorry this was a little rushed. This week is just, getting caught up on stuff has just been kind of tiresome. But I hope everybody is well, and just keep things going. I'm going to keep the ship going here. I'll keep my hand on the rubber. Keep my hand on the rudder. That was a Freudian slip. And the rudder, on a ship. Keep my hand on the rudder. And get us through these choppy waters. And maybe you'll